Welcome to the Book Fair Podcast. My name is Anthony, and this show is all about children's literature and the freedom to read. This week, we have an interview with Brittany Cooper, author of the recently released picture book, Mama Says I'm Fine. Next week, we will have another episode covering new book releases, as well as another interview on Friday. Make sure you're following the podcast wherever you are currently listening to stay up to date on the latest news in children's literature. Now, let's begin with this week's interview. Good morning, Brittany. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
I am also good. Can you start by introducing yourself and the work that we'll be discussing today for the audience?
Yes, so I'm Brittany Cooper. I'm a professor of gender studies and Africana studies at Rutgers University. I'm a Southern girl. I'm a children's book enthusiast, and I have just written a new children's book called Mama Says I'm Fine.
And what is the idea behind Mama Says I'm Fine as a book and also as a phrase?
Yes. As a book, this book is a tribute to my life as the only daughter of a single mom who, worked hard to build a life for us. And so this is a tribute to our mother daughter relationship. And my mom would often tell me when I came home, talking about being bullied at school, or if we were in the store and I was, asking for toys or candy or things that we didn't have money for, she would say, "You're fine." And in different contexts, it meant different things, but it was always this kind of reset that just said, "You're okay. Everything's okay." When I was being bullied, it meant there's nothing that you need to change. There's no problem with you. And when I was, asking for things we didn't have money for, it meant you have everything that you need.
Brittany, as someone who has gone to therapy as an adult, and I think that everybody should go to therapy and explore different techniques for coping, what this sounds a lot like to me is something that's referred to as a grounding technique, something that kind of helps you set a baseline. Was that something that was intentional in your writing of this book, or do you think is that something that your mother tried to do when she used the phrase growing up?
It wasn't intentional as a therapeutic technique, I would say, although I too have had a lot of therapy, thankfully, and also encourage all the people to get all of the therapy. But one of the things that I hope this offers is my mom was a single mom and we didn't have a lot of money. I mean, I can remember as a child, I my mom has since passed away, but my father passed away when I was a little girl. And at some point I needed grief therapy, and it took a lot of money for me to be able to have access to that therapy. And so we weren't folks that could always easily afford access. Hello, this is Brittany.
Hi, Brittany. This is Anthony.
Hi.
Okay, thank you so much. It's a totally understandable. Sometimes the internet just doesn't want to cooperate.
Yes.
Okay. And so just picking up where you had left off, you had said that you were talking about therapeutic techniques and grief counseling after your father had passed away.
Yes, and so it took a lot of resources to put me in therapy because again, my mom was a single mom and we didn't have a lot of money. And so this book really tries to capture what family life looks like when you don't always have that kind of resourcing. And so it makes total sense to me that just the reminder that the sky is not falling, that you have everything you need is a way to do a reality check-in, and a way to, ground and center yourself in space and time. And so absolutely, you know, it that affirmation could work in that way.
And you said that it captures what family life looks like when you don't have those resources available. And I think that one of the things that's very valuable in the children's book spaces is making sure that there are titles that reflect different family structures. Is that something that you are conscious of whenever you were writing for children?
Yes, absolutely. That is really a core idea for me. I can remember being a little kid, maybe fourth grade, and us having to do a family tree at school. And this was the 1980s. And so we didn't have as expansive notions of family and culture in the US as we have today. And I remember feeling like something was wrong with my family because I couldn't, fill out a father figure in a particular kind of way. And I didn't have siblings. And, I thought something was wrong with my family. And I wanted to add my aunts and my grandmother and my cousins, right? Um, and so this story that just highlights a single mother and daughter is a way to expand our notions about what family is. And I distinctly remember my mom saying to me one time, "You and I are a family." My mother was a woman of few words, but the words she said were always impactful. And so even just that you and I are a family had a similar impact as saying, "You're fine," right? It was a way to say that there is nothing pathological about you, there is nothing wrong with you, even in a world that might try to tell you that there is something wrong with you. And that certainly matters for little Black girls and Black boys and Black children who will read this book, but it matters for any kid that has been made to feel, maybe because of neurodivergence, maybe because they're kind of nerdy and they like different things and their friends like, if they've been made to feel like there's something wrong with them, then this is a book that just says, no, 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 you're not the problem. You're just fine.
And Brittany, you said that your mother was a person of few words. And I think that that's something that a lot of people can connect with. I know that when I was growing up, my dad was very, not very in touch emotionally with the people around him. And so those sparse words that he did use were very impactful. And is that a thing? Is that something that comes through with just the simple utterance of the phrase, "you're fine," coming from your mother, and also in this picture book, coming from a person who is in a role model position and also a caregiver position?
That's right. Thank you, Anthony. I mean, I think you are capturing it perfectly. That's absolutely right. This book is for children. Absolutely. It's for today's children that might be feeling the pressure of a society that offers them effusive praise all the time. But if you're told that you're extraordinary and excellent and amazing every single day, then that becomes pressure to always have to perform to the utmost standard. And sometimes that can be really difficult to do. And it actually might just be a relief to hear, like, you're fine. You met the benchmark, you're okay. And this book is also for those of us who grew up with parents from earlier generations who did not give us effusive praise, who did not do over the top things. And it brings us back into those stories and allows us to think about all of the other ways that we were being loved and cared for, all of the other ways that they showed up for us. And so I firmly believe that we are in any given moment all the people that we ever were. And this is an opportunity to speak into those earlier versions of ourselves and say, you're fine. There's nothing wrong with you. You have everything that you need. And there's also a moment in this book where I try to make space for the idea that sometimes we're not fine. Sometimes it doesn't feel like everything's going to be okay or that we have everything that we need. And so there's a scene where the little girl, sees her mom struggling to pay bills and wants to do something kind for her mom. And so the language she has is to tell her mom, you're fine. And I struggled with writing that scene because I don't want to like make kids have to be responsible for their adults, you know, but I do want to give us another way to think about a world where maybe our parents didn't say a whole lot, but where fine could mean so many different things. And it becomes a way as well for young people to recognize that so much of what we're doing with language isn't always about more words. Sometimes it's about the quality and the context in which we speak those words to each other.
And that moment in the book where the protagonist sees their own mother going through their own struggles. And even though the mother is, as you said, a person of few words, they are able to pick up on those struggles and those emotions that their parent is feeling. And that's one of the things I love about modern children's books and people who are really putting a lot of effort into writing for young audiences is that young people are far more aware and emotionally intelligent than we often give them credit for. Is that something that you are conscious of when writing, Mama Says I'm Fine?
Absolutely. One of the things that having children in my life, I'm not a mom, but I'm, a proud and active and engaged aunt and godmom. And, kids want to be taken seriously and you don't have to talk down to them, and they want to be engaged about their life. And they're also deeply observant, right? Which is why I think so many parents are like, my kid ethered me today. Um, and this storybook is dedicated to my goddaughter who, her observations about the world are so funny and so spot on all the time. And she is one of the young people that I'm writing to when I'm writing books like this, um, to give her language and ways to think about the world and ways to think about her mom, who is one of my closest friends. Um, and so, yes, I hate a world where folks talk down to young people or think that you have to dumb down for them. And I think too that that was true for us, and so I try to write books that are the kinds of books that I would have wanted to read when my mom and I were doing story time. My mom read me a bedtime story every night. And when I think about that, it is such sacred time for me because we didn't have a lot of money and we lived in public housing, but my mom instilled for me the value of education and a love of books. And it really set me up for the kinds of things that I get to do today as a teacher and a writer. And I wanted books that really, represented my experience. And when I was a little girl, I didn't get to see so many of those kinds of books. And today, my gift is to be able to give that kind of storytelling back to young people, and hopefully heal it even for those of us who didn't get those stories before.
And you talked a little bit about your work as a teacher and a writer. You've mentioned that you are a professor of gender and Africana studies, and your biography also lists you as a cultural theorist. Can you talk a little bit about what those roles mean to you and how that influences your work as a writer?
Yes. So, Anthony, I always wanted to be a teacher, because I had great teachers growing up. And I just thought that they had the coolest job ever, because you get to read books for a living and talk to people about them. And so now I just get to do that with big kids, and I think that living in a world of books, but using what we learn in those books to be able to understand our political moment and to imagine other ways that we could arrange the world so that we could be kind to each other and not enact hierarchies and forms of dominance and violence with each other is very important. And so that's the work that I do in gender studies and Africana studies. I write about the long history of Black women's activism and leadership and writing. And so when they call me a cultural theorist in these biographies that you have to write, they really mean that I'm a person who tries to think about where we are, as a culture, as a country, and try to put forward some ideas about ways that we could get better, ways that we could overcome racism and white supremacy, ways that we could overcome patriarchy, ways that we could overcome all of the isms and phobias that shape our times. And so those are things I'm really committed to. And it's one of the reasons that I want to be in conversation with young people through my books because, you know, from the time you get here, you're observing things about the world. And the earlier that we can get language to help us to understand, the world as it is, we can also perhaps begin the work of imagining how to build a world that is more hospitable and kind to every single person who is on the planet.
And so you mentioned that as a cultural theorist, you're examining ways to overcome the patriarchy and white supremacy. And I'm a firm believer that art is inherently political. Children's books
Yes.
are a form of art. They include pictures by artists. They are written by authors who are artists, just with words instead of pictures. And can you
Yes.
talk a little bit about the intentional decision in choosing a character that reflects yourself, that reflects your childhood, of showing a single mother of color and how that is inherently political?
It is absolutely political and unapologetically so. I grew up in an era where we talked about single mother households as being broken families. And it has always bothered me because what a family is supposed to do for a child is to give them all of the love and care that they need, and as much resourcing as possible so that they can go out into the world and become who they need to become. And that is absolutely what my mother and her sisters and my grandmother, that is what they did for me, is that they gave me love and affirmation, care and kindness, support, and resources from their modest resources to go out into the world, and to become the first person in our family to graduate from college and to go on to be, a teacher of big kids, as I like to think of it. And so we live in a society that maligns single mothers, that maligns Black women, that maligns Black mothers. My mother was awesome, but this is also me being a champion of Black women and Black mothers and the, hard task that they have. But it is also my desire in normalizing a story of a single mom and her daughter. It is also to say, look, this is a universal story. There is a reason why people love the Gilmore Girls, which is really my favorite show on the planet, um, because folks can understand these kind of scrappy come up stories, and Black families and Black life should be included in the way that we understand American families and all their richness and diversity.
And Brittany, the final question that I always ask every guest on the podcast is more of an open-ended one, and it's an opportunity for you to give your final words for anything that we may not have been able to cover. And that question is, Brittany, how do you see yourself and the work that you do as a writer?
That's a great question. I see myself as a champion and an advocate for the underdog, and for stories of those who get overlooked in our society. And I see myself as one who wants to create a world that, in particular, is more hospitable and loving towards Black women and girls, because I'm a firm believer that if we get better at loving Black women and girls, we can get better at loving everybody on the planet. So even when my stories center Black women and girl protagonists, as Mama Says I'm Fine does, I want people to see that as a universal invitation to think about struggle, to think about kindness, to think about what we all share in our stories, what connects us and brings us together. Those are lessons that I learned from the Black women who raised me. Um, to be kind to everybody, to be thoughtful and concerned, to do what you can to make the world better, to use the resources that you have to enrich and to teach, and to invite people into a conversation. And I want stories about people who look like me and look like people that I know. And I see myself as a writer, as getting to tell those kinds of stories. And look, there's always going to be some super dope, very powerful Black girls in every story that I tell, because I think they will save the world.
Thank you. That was an interview with Brittany Cooper. Her newest book, Mama Says I'm Fine, is available now. Brittany Cooper does not have an official website listed, though she is on social media under the username Professor_Crunk. If you appreciate the work being done on this show, there are a number of ways to show your support. First, you can like, comment, or follow wherever you are currently listening to help push the show to new listeners. Second, you can follow on Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky at BookFairPod. Lastly, you can follow the show on Patreon at patreon.com/thebookfair. Following is free, and there are no posts hidden behind a paywall. Of course, the best way to help the Book Fair podcast grow is simply to share it with a friend, an educator, or a young reader in your life. Thank you so very much for listening, and as always, I'll talk at you next time.